Good morning, everyone. Noah, as we say in our Pawnee language. Wow, that I'm filled with a lot of emotion, and this was amazing. And I'm like, how do I follow that? You weren't kidding, Karen. When she's like, that's a tough act to follow. I am so honored to be here this morning. This is extraordinary. I've just only begun to learn about the work of Achieving the Dream, and when Dr. Cheryl Crazy Bull, president of the American Indian College Fund, first told me about this, said, you need to be there. And now I understand why. And so I'm just really honored to be here. And, as, kind of listening to the work, kind of the quick bio of what my life has been, as I stand up here this morning, first and foremost, I am up here as a mother. I am up here as a citizen of the Pawnee Nation. As an auntie, as a sister, as a former student, and that's the place where my story comes from, and stories are powerful, and that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. And really, I'm here to tell a story with a lot of different layers. I'm here to tell a story that is not of the making of Native peoples in this country. It's a story that has been authored by non-Native peoples to kind of rationalize and sweep under the rug genocide, violence, and a lot of other things. I'm here to tell you a story also, though, about personal and collective action. A story about saying enough is enough, and a story about how we can make change today and in the future. So what I'm about to do is, as I dive into this, is I'm going to hose you down with data. I'm going to give you a nice, cozy data blanket, and it's going to blow your hair back, and it's going to be really depressing, probably. You're like, bring the students back up. They're so much more inspiring and fun. But I promise this story ends well. But, as part of this original creation story, really the Reclaiming Native Truth Project and the idea to do this research came about in about 2015. And I've worked in Indian country my whole life. I've worked for my own tribe, the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. I've worked, for Native nonprofits all over the country, grassroots, grass tops. I've been everywhere, I feel like. And I was at the time heading up a foundation called the Notabegay, the Third Foundation, and our mission was really about addressing the great health disparities that face Native American children, childhood obesity, type 2 diabetes, and I would advocate all over the country and for children's health, right, and our disparities. But every time I walked into a room, I was typically the only Native American in that room talking about grave health issues, of which our children were the highest. We faced the greatest disparities when it came to these issues. And every time I sat in these rooms, in some very moneyed rooms and of power and influence, and researchers from across the country would put data up, because data is what informs decision making and how we allocate resources. And time again, I never saw our Native children in that data because we were statistically insignificant. And as I've worked in my life, and I've grown up in a family that has fought for tribal sovereignty and civil rights their whole lives. And as I began to talk to a lot of colleagues and people in my family, and I thought, we have made such great strides as Native peoples in this country, but yet we are not gaining the kind of traction that we need to really overcome these things that we did not necessarily bring onto ourselves, right? Because of colonization, genocide, and what this federal government and its policies have done. But yet, still we feel invisible, still we don't feel like we're taken seriously. Why is that? And it was so pervasive. It didn't matter who I was talking to. On a personal level, my daughter at the time was in middle school. She was a 6th grader. And her name is beautiful. It's Dakota. It's Wichakbi Wiyan, which means Star Woman. And her father and I were very intentional about when we gave her that name coming into this world. And she was relentlessly bullied, teased. Teachers made fun of her and stopped even calling her name on the roster in the mornings, or they just call her, by her last name, just anything, because they didn't want to pronounce it. And the bullying got so bad that she finally came and told me, and I went and talked to the principal. And the principal said, it's your fault, because you gave her that name that's not English. You should change her name. And that will solve the problem. And I just remember being so enraged to be told this and to just feel this powerlessness, right, as I sat in this principal's office and my daughter having to hear that. And sure enough, the next year she entered into 7th grade, she said, "Mom, I want to be called Star from now on." And how devastating that was, because what a proud name it was. And I have a lot of other stories like that, right, that just were personal, but, the bias, when we went to the doctor when she attempted to commit suicide, and the doctor kept, as the intake person was filling out that form, kept saying, "So you don't have a job and you don't have health insurance, right?" And making assumptions about alcoholism and other things in our families. And I thought, just because of my last name and because the box says Native American, you've already created a story for my daughter and I. So these very personal stories that this isn't just about me, this is a story of so many, is what prompted for me to say enough is enough. And I got lots of super smart people together and we decided we needed research to really combat. We needed data. We needed to understand what is going on in the minds of Americans. What do they think about Native Americans? What do decision makers think about Native Americans, and why? And how does that show up in the world? And how does that impact Native peoples? And we really wanted to begin to wrap our arms around that so that we could begin to figure out, how do we make change, right? And so this is where we began the story. So the Reclaiming Native Truth Project was a $3.3 million project. It was the largest public opinion research project ever done about Native Americans. And we were really, I always have to call out the generosity of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Was the first money in. They put $2.5 million. It would have never happened without them. It gave us incredible resources to bring the top minds in the country from different research disciplines to really help us do a 360. And so you can see the research was extensive in terms of focus groups all across the country. National polls that were nationally representative, 2,000 plus people. We did in-depth interviews with members of Congress and sitting federal judges and their law clerks, people within the White House and different agencies, heads of philanthropy and media and entertainment and faith-based communities. We talked to everybody. We spent a lot of time talking to college students. When you see that 13,000 plus number, we went to a dozen universities across the country to really go in and talk to college students. And then you see the incredible amount of data on social media, that social listening that we did. And it was remarkable what we learned. Oh. Come on, technology. There we go. So our number one finding, as we really, and we're talking about public perception, was that invisibility is the greatest barrier facing Native peoples. And if there's any Native people here in the room, which we just heard, I saw the wonderful student, Jennifer over here, a lot of Native people will come up to me and say, "You spent $3.3 million to figure out we're invisible?" Like, I could have told you that. Pay me the money. Point well taken, but what was powerful about it is that we really began to unpack what is the impact of invisibility. So as we began to kind of look at it, we began to think about what are the root causes. And this was a study that was actually done a couple years prior to Reclaiming Native Truth by Professor Sarah Shears and her colleagues, in which they found that nearly 90% of the schools in the country don't teach about Native Americans past 1900. And you see that, that crazy number of states that fail to even mention us. And so think about that as a moment. We get sort of relegated to ancient Greece, Rome, days gone by, where people don't hear about us anymore. And what that effectively conditions the American public, and we're talking generation after generation of Americans coming out of these K-12 systems, literally conditioned to think that Native peoples do not exist in a contemporary context anymore. And really, typically, when you go out and look at the textbooks are first off not written by Native peoples, right? Those stories, that's the master narrative. That's what you're being asked to learn about. And it's typically maybe 1890 Wounded Knee, you're gonna learn about the Lakota. And you're not going to learn about the 600 plus nations that were here and are here, right? And the diversity of the culture, the language, the governments, all of that. You're not taught that. And so I remember when I first learned this, because how many Native people in the room have been asked at some point, do you still live in a teepee? Right? That's why. This is why. Now, it's not just somebody acting a fool, right? This is literally how Americans are conditioned to think, and this is sort of the last data point, and now it helps us to understand. We also learned through the brilliant work of Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, who is from the Tulalip tribes and at the University of Michigan, that media and popular culture are major drivers behind this invisibility. And so when you look at TV and film, our representation hovers somewhere between 0 to 0.04% in TV and film. And when we really drilled down with the help of UC Berkeley and the Annenberg Center to kind of understand what lives in that sliver of representation, it's all the tropes that are really harmful and stereotypical. The savage, right? The mystical, magical Indian, right? That we're drunks, that we're just sort of pitiful, and oftentimes very over-sexualized representations of Native women in which, there's been some work looking into that. It seems like a lot of times when Native women do appear on film, they're actually being sexually assaulted. And so then what really blew my hair back was when learning that 95% of the images that come up on Google are before 1900, and they're of men. And when you think about the sheer amount of data, right, that Google has, and to see that's what comes to the surface, is insane, right? The great news more recently is that since the election of Congresswoman Deb Haaland and Congresswoman Sharice Davids, the two first Native American women to be elected to Congress, they're cracking through, right? And so, but that shows exactly, that shows the power of visibility. But again, these big systems are really perpetuating this. And so what we found as we began to look at these three systems, K through 12 education, popular culture, and media, we found that 72% of Americans rarely or never encounter information about Native peoples. That's a big number. And then it corresponded with a different national poll that we did that nearly 80% of Americans know little to nothing about Native peoples. And a significant part of that number actually aren't even sure if we exist anymore. It's stunning. And so what this invisibility does, and what our research, and I really encourage you to kind of get in and read it, is that what we begin to understand is that invisibility, it's just not that you don't show up, it actually creates a bias within the brain. Because when someone is invisible, they're not human, right? You don't think about them, they're not human. You can't empathize with something that you can't see or don't think that exists. And this is a significant problem. So when we look at what are the effects of invisibility, when we interviewed members of Congress, they were very clear with us. This is an issue. This does impact policy. This is a big one. We also, when we interviewed federal judges, and for those of you that don't understand, federal Indian law, tribal sovereignty, we exist in a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government. And so when we talk about legal jurisdiction, the federal courts are the ones with jurisdiction with regard to tribes. The majority of judges we interviewed had never even taken a federal Indian law course. And they struggled to even really define what tribal sovereignty was. And we had one judge say, well, federal Indian law, it's nonsensical, it's irrational, and indigenous means primitive. These are the people that are rendering the decisions that affect the lives of Native Americans and tribes, and our treaties, our treaty rights in this country. I can't imagine a judge sitting on the federal, bench hasn't taken contract law or, some kind of criminal law that informs your decision making on that bench. But this is what we deal with in this country. We also look at that. What invisibility does is when you can't see anyone, you don't know what's happening with them. So the fact that what that translates is that when we went out, 66% of Americans don't think we face discrimination. But in a poll done at about the same time we did our polling by NPR and Harvard and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation found that 75% of Native Americans think they face significant discrimination. So that discrepancy is huge. And so what we've learned about all of this is that our erasure and our invisibility is literally being institutionalized and perpetuated within these big systems, right? K through 12, popular culture, entertainment, media, are systems of governance in this country. And so for me, as we really began to learn this, it was empowering, right? It was mind-blowing and devastating, but it was empowering because now I know that this isn't just sort of random acts, right, of someone. This is big systems. And it really began to, give us a lot of hope that we at least knew what we're dealing with. But make no mistake, and what our researchers found, the top social psychologists in the country, is that invisibility is the modern form of racism against Native peoples. And when I say that, we have to let that sink in because we don't have a monopoly on that. I know that there are students in your institutions. I'm sure there's many of you as educators and working this where you have felt that invisibility from your community, right? And how just dehumanizing that is, how demoralizing it is to not be seen, not be heard. We heard students talking about that this morning. So we really need to understand that I'm here to talk to you about Native Americans today, but this is applicable well beyond just our peoples. The other flip side about invisibility is that it creates a void, right? When you can't see people, and in this void, it gets filled with a lot of not great stuff, right? That is not authored by Native peoples, right? It's these myths that get perpetuated. It's toxic stereotypes. It's these betrayals that we see on TV or in film in these big systems that I was telling you about. And so what we found as we went out and through focus groups and our polling, that the top two most toxic stereotypes about Native Americans are that Native peoples receive free government benefits. How many people have heard that we don't pay for college? Right? We don't pay taxes. All those great pervasive myths, they're completely false. But they are so pervasive in the American consciousness. And we also heard, well, they get all this free stuff, but yet they get these casinos. So it's the double thing. They get all this free stuff and they're getting rich off the casinos. And I sat and I watched focus groups, and I watched focus groups with other people of color who we should theoretically be standing in solidarity because we share so many of the same issues around systemic oppression and bias and racism. And I watched those focus groups, outside through the ones, and I could see that it created resentment amongst other people of color. Because they're like, why do they get that? We've had a hard time. We have our stories. We have faced these things. Why aren't we getting that? When it's simply not true, right? The things that Native peoples do receive is based on their treaty rights for giving up their land that this country sits on. There's nothing free about it. But yet, these myths are lying to us, and it's sowing divisions at times when we should be really coming together and working on common solutions, and that's why it's so important. And when we look at the casinos, out of the casinos that exist in the United States, not every tribe has one, but out of those, less than 20% are actually profitable, right? My casino, not profitable. I'm not getting a big check, I can assure you. But these are really toxic myths that we have to address. The other thing, as I said about this void, that it gets filled with stuff that's not authored by Native peoples. And so just a couple weeks ago, racism was on display at the Super Bowl. Now imagine if that stadium had been filled with people in blackface. It would have never even happened. We would have not gotten that far, right? But yet it was okay, and the chants and all of those things. And so we watched, 1 billion people across the world got to see racism on display on Sunday, and it just sort of went by, right? Because we need to change the values and the norms in the country because it's about money. And we can love our teams, but this is not honoring Native people, right? These are the other things that when we look at representation, this is the only thing that people get to see about us, right? These sort of caricatures and these sort of the imagination of non-native writers in Hollywood and the ways that they want to portray us. And 9 times out of 10, none of these writers, these studios have ever gone to a native person and said, is that accurate? Is that how you look? Is that how you talk? Is this? Never, right? And that's a problem. And so this slide is upsetting. It's appalling. It should make your skin crawl. But this is the majority of representation of Native women in media. And there's research be done right now, but I can tell you, Native women face the highest rates of sexual assault in this country. And the majority of those assaults are committed by non-Native men. More than 5,700 Indigenous women and girls have been missing or murdered. In January, just in January, 500 went missing. And their families are fighting for the police and others to just even look for them. So don't tell me that there's not a connection when this is how people see us. Right? This is why it's important, as uncomfortable as this is, to really understand how powerful representation and story is. All right, everybody take a deep breath. I'm going to take a deep breath. So what's really been fascinating about this research, right, is it's taken me all kinds of places and taken Illuminate of all kinds of places. We published in the summer of 2018, and that fall I got a call from a comedian by the name of Jordan Klepper at Comedy Central. And he said, we read about you in Teen Vogue and the research, and we want to do my show, dedicate an entire episode on your research. And I was like, what? I don't know if that's a good idea. And actually, it ended up being a very good idea. So if I could ask the technical people to cue it up, I'm just going to give you a little taste of the power of story. Possibly. Is it going to work? Maybe not. Should we move on? How many people have heard of Jordan Klepper? Oh, wow. Cool. Well, why we're hopefully teeing it up, what was really neat, and I think there's a shift happening in this country. As much as I'm hammering you with this data that is really upsetting, was the fact that they read the research and they said, we want to call you, and we not only want to talk about this research in our episode, but we want you to really consult with us the whole step of the way. And we want to make sure that Native voices are in there. And when we started talking about them visiting different communities, they really brought community to the table. They wanted to get it right. And I think
according to a new report co-led by Crystal Echohawk, Native Americans face massive social problems because of their invisibility in media.
So where are you pointing the finger? Is this not me, right?
It's everywhere. And when they do show up, they're either these stereotypes about the mystical, magical Indian or drunks or over-sexualized Native women. We're really sort of relegated to these historical stereotypes.
She's right. This representation is everywhere. Books, butter substitutes, television, cigarettes, Victoria's Secret models, movies, mascots, costumes, cornmeal, Coachella. Misrepresentation is a magical cloak of invisibility. It would be like using a caricature of Martin Van Buren to depict all white people and their experiences.
And it's still very much accepted within the United States to engage in this level of racism. The Washington football team, that is a racial slur, right? The R word is a racial slur. It's the N word. When Megyn Kelly, when all that blew up around the blackface, right? America was like quick, but what nobody noticed, if you watch that segment, those horrible Native American costumes were in the background.
Somehow both invisible and in plain sight. Now let's rewind.
You cannot dress as a Native American. That's apparently been some rule. Isn't the whole purpose of Halloween to dress up and pretend you are something other than yourself?
People understand that blackface increasingly is wrong. People don't understand that that's sort of, objectification and misrepresentation of Native peoples is wrong as well.
If we could double kick out Megyn Kelly, I think a lot of people would.
Right, seriously.
Can I come clean with you?
Yes.
I was in a thing called Indian Guides. It was like the Boy Scouts, but somehow whiter.
Why Indian Guides? A great idea.
Here's some of the literature from the Indian Guides. 20 teepee tales. This is my vest. No. Could somebody, seriously? Ty, can you help me get out of this? I wore a headdress, and I didn't think much of it. And to be honest, it was a fun bonding thing with my dad. But I look back on what that was, and I feel weird about it.
Yeah, you should. What is it about that program? Like, why don't you guys have
I
that?
think the reason we co-opted the idea of Indian Guides is because our own traditions are slavery, institutional racism, and cultural genocide, which are not exactly great weekend activities for a father and son. How do I be an ally, not an appropriator?
You need to go meet people who've been.
Isn't that great? He was great. So in this moment, I actually want to ask you a favor. I'd like you to close your eyes, because I want to ask you a couple questions for you to think about. And as you've been listening to me, you know, have you ever had to deal with stereotypes about you and where you come from, who your people are? You know, how did these affect you and your community, your family, right? Have you ever felt that invisibility when you're sitting in a room and you just don't have a voice? You just feel like they literally can't see you? Now ask yourself the harder question. Do you hold some stereotypes about others around you? Have you experienced that? Do you think maybe as you kind of dive into that maybe you might have some bias somewhere in there about other people that maybe you don't know about? Have you ever really experienced discrimination and racism? Have you watched it played out? And what did you do? Open your eyes. Those are the really important questions that we need to ask ourselves. And I can promise you, everybody has bias. Implicit bias, it lives in our subconscious because we are surrounded, these systems I told you about, like education and media and popular culture, and just, we're in a 24/7 news cycle right now. All of those inputs, those form the way that we think about the world. And as these inputs go in, it starts to shape the subconscious, these schemas. It's how we organize information. And it can create bias sometimes that we're not necessarily consciously aware of, right? And that's the deep work that we all have to do because everybody's human, right? And that's the work of unpacking that and figuring out how we move forward. And that's not just with regard to Native peoples, that's with regard to everybody, right? So what was exciting after all that heavy data, right, was that we learned a lot. And what we learned is that there is a pathway forward. There's a way to change this story of invisibility and erasure, the story of these toxic stereotypes and these kind of false myths. And there's a way to change that story for one that is really accurate and about contemporary people and about moving us forward. And so stories, you know, when we talk about narratives, and narrative change is like the buzzword right now. It's just a fancy way of just talking about story and how we change stories, because stories are powerful in our society. They, you know, from the one-on-one and what you grew up with in your families to the master story of this country and how it came to be, right? These are powerful, powerful things that shape our behavior, our attitudes, our culture, everything. And so really when we talk about narrative change and we talk about changing the story, it's really about how do we go about dismantling these stories that can be very harmful, and how do we really look at systems and ways to kind of uplift new stories that can really get out into society and culture and really educate, right, and shift. And we talk about to literally that the power of story can move hearts and minds in really beautiful and powerful ways. They can move people to action. And so after we went through and we learned all of these different things that I had in those previous slides, we also saw something as we sat in focus group rooms with folks, is that when we began to really actually educate them, that Native Americans do pay taxes, we pay for college. We talk about the more than 500 treaties in this country that were broken. People didn't know that, right? Because of the education system. And when we talked to them, it was just about our core values as Native peoples, right? That we value family. We value our children. We value our spiritual life ways. We value the land from which we come. We have a deep connection to that. And we reminded them that we are still here, right? That we do exist. And we exist in strong and vibrant ways. We're diverse. We're a lot of different things. And Standing Rock actually was helpful, because Standing Rock suddenly blew a lid off that invisibility for just a minute and reminded the world that Native peoples are still here, and they were on the front lines defending their water, and they were being fire hosed. And we are still feeling that effect, right? It suddenly kind of woke everyone up. But what we did is, with all of that learning, we went back out, we did our final national poll, and we figured out that words matter, right? Stories matter, and how we just frame things with someone, just even kind of tweaking it, can make a difference. And so we went out and we wanted to ask Americans again about our issues that we most care about, issues impacting our children, issues impacting our education, our environment, our healthcare, other kinds of things. And we saw a dramatic change. We went from that 80% of people who don't know anything, they still don't know anything, it didn't change, right? But all of a sudden they're like, we want to learn more. And actually, we're really upset that we didn't learn this in school, and we can't, when we turn on the TV or when I Google, it's not evident. We also saw that 80% of Americans, nearly 80%, support increased representation across the board in Hollywood, TV, film, all forms of media. They're hungry for that. And this has been powerful, and this is why this research has taken me to very unexpected places. When I'm at Disney presenting to studio executives, or at Amazon, or all these interesting places, because of this research, we got to produce the film for Oscar winner Wes Studi last fall, when he was honored, and showed that in Hollywood. It was the first ever Native-produced film to be shown in front of the Academy to honor this. But this is what this research is suddenly sort of doing, and that is the power of data. And that's the power of story. This was also what we saw as well, is that nearly 72% of Americans support significant changes to K through 12 curricula. And I think that as we begin to kind of look at our colleges as well, I mean, this isn't just about those K through 12 systems, this is about all our systems of learning and education, right? People want to learn about Native peoples. They want the accurate history, and they want to also learn about who we are today. This was also really exciting, that nearly 74% of people under the age of 30 were down. They are ready to support Native peoples. And I think, looking at that, and that's very specific to our issues, but when I looked at this amazing lineup of rock stars on stage today, this generation is saying enough is enough. Enough is enough for racism and discrimination and bias. The time has come. And so this is really about all of the power of story, is that we have to take action, right? This research would be nothing if it wasn't about taking it out into the world and telling the story, but then also really about how do we take this and go back into our communities, our institutions, our places of worship, all kinds of places, right? And really look at, let's have a conversation about this. Do you show up anywhere in this research? Is this research somehow applicable to where you come from, maybe, and how you feel? Those are the conversations. And how does this show up, right? How are Native students not showing up in your institutions? And I think I am such a just passionate believer in our tribal college movement. It is amazing. We have one at Pawnee Nation College, but you have so many Native students in non-Native institutions as well. Right? And so it's going back, how do we really address some of these things? How are they living and breathing within our institutions? Because I assure you, they are. It's everywhere, it's pervasive, but this is really about how we take action. And so the way that we really, as we begin to learn through the research, is how do you change the narrative? How do you change the story? And part of that is disrupting invisibility. And I'm so grateful to the leadership of Achieving the Dream for asking me to be here, because this is what disruption looks like. It's a Native face up here on stage. It's a Native student on your panel, right, up here today. And it's a lot of different ways that you ensure that, wow, like whether, I just was on a panel the other day with these 2 students, from Stanford and Duke, who were talking about how they really had to fight within their institutions to create Native student associations and particular types of services, or, land acknowledgements. But land acknowledgements, by the way, they don't mean much unless you're willing to take action. How are you including Native peoples today, and not just acknowledging who was there before? It's bringing it into the present. And it is about smashing toxic stereotypes, any kind of stereotypes, because they're damaging, right? And no more will we be told, you know what, when the mascot issue comes up, oh, Native peoples have so many more important things to worry about. But what we've learned through this research is that these types of stereotypes, they fuel bias and racism and ignorance about who we are, and it does impact policy. It does promote hate. During the Super Bowl, there were 72,000 hate tweets about Native Americans because it was people tweeting about the Kansas City Chiefs, right? It does, and it's harmful. It's harmful. It creates hostile environments for our Native children and our people. And we need to do this, and this is applicable across all folks. Stereotypes are bad. They're not good, right? And we really need to look at how we really address those and dismantle them across the board. And this is also about continuously looking at how do we amplify Native voices, right? And the voices of those that don't always get the chance to speak. Oftentimes, the most well-intentioned people will try to speak on behalf of us, and no more. We have to be given that microphone, the platform, to really be able to tell our story, and that is applicable to your students from diverse backgrounds, right? No one else can tell their story and have the impact other than them, and we have, those stories are beautiful, right? Those stories make us all better. And it is really about taking action, right? It's being intentional, right? And these things are tough. And these conversations are tough, and they can get often very uncomfortable. But the reward is great, right? The reward is absolutely exceptional in terms of the kind of change, and I think the world that we are moving towards. And so it just really, where I want to leave you with is thinking about, as we think about all of this, and I just want to say thank you for listening, right? And I appreciate you giving this consideration. And maybe some things made you uncomfortable. Maybe you don't necessarily agree. And I invite that conversation. That's a wonderful place to start. But as you're kind of thinking about this, and not only thinking about Native students, Native peoples, but people, students and people from diverse backgrounds, we have to be asking ourselves, as you're in these powerful institutions that are shaping the minds that are going to lead this country and make change, what is our vision for the future? Right? What kind of world do we want to live in? Right? And I think we want to live in a world where we support each other and we don't hate each other. That we're not living in a time when it is so divided and polarized. So how, in our own ways, in what we can control, and that is within our institutions, how do we really look about how we make systematic change and meaningful change? Because what we really, truly believe is that if you can change that story, you're going to change the future. And it's just like the great imagination, the radical imagination about how when we tell stories that are inclusive, where people show up and all their beauty and all of their pain, all of that, and then you think about just the ripple effect of about the positive things that can bring about, and what these stories, right? And I know that this is something that, you've heard beautiful stories from last year and the year before. It really does fuel beautiful change that we all benefit from. And so I want to invite you to go to our website, illuminatives.org. We have a tab called Take Action. And we were very deliberate and intentional about creating a lot of resources because we want people to use this research. My dream is that all of you are out there doing this presentation, right? And out there really, yes, that is the dream, And so we have infographics, things that you can download, put into presentations. We actually have a model PowerPoint. We've got videos, we've got one-pagers, we've got everything, and really encourage you to make use of those resources. And to really join with us in this movement, which is a movement of many movements to change the story and to change the future. And I hope you'll follow us on Illuminative online. Thank you, everyone.